My Mother, the Person and the Patient is an original podcast written and hosted by me, Fortuna Kuso. This podcast is about my mother, Timira Abdussamid Mohammed, Ayaya we call her, and that's the Somali word for grandmother, and her great-grandchildren call her Ayaya too, and that is their way of saying great-grandmother. In the last episode, I spoke about how Alzheimer's, which I to this day consider to be the enemy, my enemy, a thief that robbed my mother, that robbed me, my mother, the storyteller, my mother, the kind woman, my mother, the intelligent woman. But I also realized it's offering me some kind of comfort. At least I am taking it as though Alzheimer's is offering me a comfort in a time where I am in the depth of grief over the loss of my daughter. The reason I say that is that my mother was sick last December of 2022. In fact, so sick, the doctors and us as a family, we felt that was it. This was the end. She would go, to the point that the doctors ordered all the medication that you need, all the support that you need for the end of life care was put in place, and she was admitted to hospice, which you might or might not know. It's where people get support at the end of their life. So that's where we were. But the medication the doctors gave her, the support from the nurses coming into the house helped, and my mother recovered and rallied back up and gradually got better. For the last few weeks, my mother is doing so much better that she's sleeping through the night. She is interacting, however limited her interaction is. She's doing her activities. Her water intake is fantastic. All her vital systems are working the way they're supposed to be. So I am really happy about that. And last week, the doctor from hospice visited us in the home, and then she assessed my mother, her vitals, her blood pressure, her oxygen level intake, all that. And she said to me at the end that your mother doesn't need to be in hospice anymore. She is well enough, and she's not at the end of her life, and she doesn't need to be in hospice. I knew my mother was doing much better than she was towards the end of last year, but to hear the doctor say it, to hear the doctor tell me that she is well enough not to be a patient in the hospice care program, that made me relieved. And I think it's almost like as I go through the grief of losing my daughter, Alzheimer's is giving me a break and not adding more to my already full plate, not making me worry about my mother when I am already overwhelmed with this loss. As you can see, my relationship with Alzheimer's is shifting in a way that I still see it as the enemy. It's immeasurable, the things that Alzheimer's had taken from my mother, from me, and from my family. But it's still at this very moment, as I stand in this crossroads of dealing with being a caregiver to my mother and with losing my daughter, I am grateful that my mother is in a better place. And I am getting this relief when I'm saying, this is really good. She's not refusing to drink water, take medication, eat, sleep when she's supposed to, and do her little activities that I do with her. So I am working in reconciling the Alzheimer's that I hate, the Alzheimer's that's a thief, the Alzheimer's that robbed so much for my mother, for my family, for myself, and the Alzheimer's that seemed to relent at this point and keep my mother in an even keel, in a place where she is well enough that I could worry less about her. And that has made all the difference. When you listen to how we arrived at my mother's diagnosis and what followed, it's so easy to see her just as the patient, to see her as nothing more than the disease that reduced her to shell of her old self. But I want also to tell you about my mother, the person, the fierce woman that told her stories unapologetically, celebrating the beautiful parts and harsh realities equally. I want to share with you the stories she told us about her life as a girl growing up in a small village, the tales that marked her adulthood. I want to share with you all her losses and the ultimate winnings. The following chapter is one of those stories reconstructed from my childhood memory. The connection between Timira and Muhammad, born from their losses, blossomed into a deep relationship that transcended her failures, beyond his limitations, beyond the sorrows of her past. She developed a feeling that gave life a new meaning. In his company, she faced no judgment. The freedom to express herself emerged with the sight of his beautiful face. That didn't mean the grief of losing her children lessened. If anything, the stabbing daggers of their absence grew sharper, knowing what was possible had she married the right man, found a partner for life. It was because of such a realization that she had agreed to marry Muhammad when he'd asked her only 2 months after the night they talked. But she knew convincing her father and the elder would be near impossible. She feared her father's reaction, mainly disappointment, when she showed up with a man she wanted to marry. Muhammad told her the name of his tribe, but without the elder and her father to verify, she was taking his word for it, but her father and the elder wouldn't. "We're going with you," her cousin said to allay her worry. "My husband and I." It was difficult to share Dahab's confidence because she had a sordid reputation according to the people in Timira's village. The tales of how she took off with a man neither her father nor the elder approved almost 30 years before and never looked back circulated far and wide, and the lifestyle she'd led after she left home, joining a youth group in opposition to colonial rule, didn't win her any points. Timira's father was the only one of Dahab's 4 siblings that had any relationship with her. "They won't listen to you." As the bus zipped, the landscape zooming by them fast, Timira reminded her cousin, "You know how they feel about you." "I'll convince your father." Dahaba had a thoughtful gaze when she said that. "For the elder, we give him the option, and what he does with it is out of our control." In her 50s, Dahaba was more defiant now than Timira remembered from the stories told by the villagers. The 5-hour bus ride from the city of Luq to her small village of Yed did nothing to lessen her anxiety. Even the mature corn plants swaying in the summer breeze in the farms that lined both sides of the roadway didn't lift her spirit as it had done before. She hadn't touched the sweet bread the Heba had handed her when they boarded. All she could think about was the miles that drifted by, moving her closer to the trouble ahead. By the time they reached her family's homestead, Timira was shaking. "You want to marry a man you know nothing about?" The elder accosted Timiro. Where is his elder? His father? Has he no one? A branch cut off from an unknown tree? We have known this man for over 15 years. The Habib's husband spoke tentatively. We? The elder shouted toward Noor. We? He said again, as if his anger didn't show in his last word, and he needed to be sure about it. And you want me to take your word for it? Each syllable of that statement was accentuated with so much force. Noor sat up, his back straight. Did you forget how you disgraced us, taking the Haba as if she belonged to no one? I belong to no one. The Haba wasn't apologetic. And you came here to do what? The elder leaned forward, pointing a long, thin, unwrinkled finger toward the Haba. To let Timira stray as you'd done to yourself? The bitterness in the elder's voice sounded like the Haba had eloped yesterday and just returned home. She left 2 marriages we set up for her, and you want to add the 3rd without our consent? The elder might have hoped the Haba would relent, but she didn't. You didn't set mine, and it's still working. The word jabs between the Haba and the elder would have continued like that if Timira's father hadn't taken the elder out of the room. They were gone for 20 long and agonizing minutes before her father led the elder back in the room. Timira's father took Muhammad's hand in his. I am trusting you with my daughter, he said. This is my firstborn. He rested his other hand on Timira's knee. Even though he didn't look at her, she could tell tears filled his eyes, and his voice shook with every word. Muhammad nodded but said nothing in response. You hear me? Her father asked. I am trusting you with my child. Muhammad nodded again, this time a little more vigorously than the last time. I only agree because she wants it to be this way. A layer of hesitation sat on her father's words. You promise me you will cause her no harm. Muhammad looked at him for the first time since her father took his hand. I promise no harm will come to her, not if I could help it. He pulled her father's hand up to his lips and kissed it. That sealed the deal. Within a week of her father's consent to marrying Muhammad without the necessary background check, the Haba and her stepmother threw a huge wedding party for her. She tried to dissuade them, to convince them divorced twice, there was no need to fuss over her. They weren't sending a young girl to a new home. A family dinner would suffice. Still, none of her points resonated with either of the women. You got the man you wanted, and leave the rest to us, the Haba said. You might want to enjoy your victory, her stepmother agreed. Timira's daughter's first letter arrived a few weeks after her marriage. She couldn't believe it when her husband brought the letter from the police station where he worked. She'd never expected to hear from Amina, not after that angry note she'd sent over a year ago. She pulled the envelope out of Muhammad's hand and turned it over twice before opening it. Timira unsealed it carefully, took the page out and handed it to her husband. Read, read, read. She couldn't wait for the 2 seconds it took to unfurl the paper. Dear mother, it began. On this note, Amina, almost 12, was more conciliatory than angry. Aunt Layla told me some things that happened to you. In a tone far less accusatory, she told Timira about her life. I'm not mad at you anymore, she said. I know now you had to save yourself. Timira had her husband reread that part before moving to the next section. Abba wouldn't let us see you. When Aunt Layla asked him, he only yelled at her. I'm so happy we finally found you. My aunt helped me. The letter continued. I would have written to you sooner. But it took Layla a long time to find you. Timira listened to her daughter's words as her husband read on. And Ibrahim doesn't like writing, but he wants you to know he doesn't blame you for leaving when you did. Timira tilted her head back and tried to conjure the image of her son. But all she could see was his large brown eyes watching her as she tucked him to bed that night, the night she'd abandoned him. In her second letter, Amina spoke about her womanhood celebration party a month after the first. Realizing she wasn't there for one of her daughter's milestones broke Timira's heart. Read that again. She'd asked her husband to repeat that passage 3 times. This event had meant so much to her mother when Timira was a girl, and now she'd missed it. But she was grateful to Hassan's sister for being there to take her place. Mother, you should have seen me, Amina wrote, the henna and the dress my aunt made for me. Her daughter's excitement leapt out of the page and caressed her with comforting strokes. There was so much food. Amina's pen seemed to move quickly as if she wanted to absorb Timiro from the guilt that riddled her. As I write this letter 2 days after the celebration, we still have some of the food. Give me a second. Timira asked her husband to stop reading so she could collect herself and absorb the words. She wanted the joy that saturated her surroundings to move beneath her skin and course through her veins. She waited for the deep hurt to be washed off every cell of her body and heart. Timira waved at her husband to return to the letter. It was a good celebration. Mohammed hesitated for a fraction of a second, which alarmed Timira. She looked up to ask him what the matter was, but he continued before she could say anything. I wish you were here to share it with me. Even though that statement made Timiro feel as if the world had slapped her with sorrow, the fact that her daughter wanted her close had put a cooling ointment on the sore left behind by her absence. Timira took the paper from Mohammed, folded it, and put it back in the envelope. She placed the letter with all the correspondence from her mother-in-law and her daughter in the shoebox tucked under her bed. Timira would hold the stack of letters to her chest each night before going to bed. She would close her eyes shut. After deep breaths, Timira would feel her children's presence in the room. Amina's gentle hands would reach out to her from a distance. After returning the envelope in the box, she lay in bed, heaving with unspent tears. Amina's notes offered her comfort, but the loss of her children remained just below the surface. The slightest memory would ignite it and quickly bring the pain of the loss to the fore. A child playing or a woman carrying a baby would make her heart knock at her ribs fast, causing her head to spin. In those times, Timira would throw herself into whatever task at hand. She cooked, cleaned, and did all the housework in motion like that of a machine, no emotion attached to it. 8 months after her marriage, Timira was pregnant. That was the last thing she wanted to happen. Again, she thought to herself aloud. The new life growing inside her filled her with doubt. Despite her husband's unfailing attempt to make her comfortable, everything in her pregnancy rattled her. If anything, the fear of her inability to be a mother grew with every kick of the child inside her. She was sure she didn't have what it took to be a mother. Can I endure the hardship other mothers seem to thrive? She asked herself as she moved about the house. She felt pushed out of balance, stuck between the tiles beneath her feet and the cinder blocks that made up the home's walls. She only wanted to run away, hide from herself, for she didn't have to face another failure. She considered leaving Mohammed. It was easy to take off while her husband was at work. Soon the guilt of her thoughts against the man who was so good to her scooped her gut with every breath she took. Unlike her other pregnancies, in this one she didn't feel the overwhelming need to vomit. The smell of food didn't send her stomach hurling like it was the first time she was pregnant. The exhaustion that pulled her down after the first 4 weeks of her second pregnancy didn't hover around her this time. The unsettling feelings of irritation that came with carrying Ibrahim to term were non-existent with this one. Still, it took her 3 months to admit to herself she was pregnant, and another month before she told her husband, "You will be a father soon." She kept focusing on her knitting needle. In 5 months, Mohammed got out of his seat so fast, the bowl of soup in his hand dropped to the cement floor and shattered into the tiniest fragments. "A father?" phrase came out loud. "Did you say a father?" He was standing over Timiro by then. He put his hands under her arms and drew her to her feet. He was talking, or maybe laughing, or he might have been crying. But his reaction was nothing like she'd experienced before. Mohammed let her go but continued to holler loud. Timira waited for a minute before she gained Mohammed's attention. She needed him to hear what she had to say. This was important. "I'm not built to be a mother." If she couldn't sacrifice herself for the 3 she already had, would she be able to do it now? "It is too late for that." Mohammed laughed aloud. Timira could tell he was still riding high. "You are already on the way to being a mother for the 4th time, no less." "It's not funny." A wave of anger rose in her, and she was ready to lash out, even though her husband had done nothing to earn her ire. I shouldn't have." She couldn't finish either of the statements. "I don't have what it takes to be a mother." Timira remembered the saying, "No mother raised children without tears filling her pillow." That wasn't her. She couldn't be that kind of mother. "Of course you do. You carried children for 9 months and breastfed them." "That is the easy part," she said, and she believed it too. "If it were that easy, why don't I have children?" he asked. "I am 35-year-old with no children." His line of argument made no sense to her. He didn't have children because he was a man. But what was Timira's excuse? Mother must give up her comfort for that of her children, to put up their needs before her own. She stopped and turned to her husband. He was staring at her, his face creased with so much confusion. "I can't do that. With me, your comfort is as important as your child's." He took her hand in his. "My stepfather raised my brother and me, but couldn't give birth. Only my mother could do that. If that's not a sacrifice, I don't know what is." That statement brought a smile to Timira's face. "Thank you," she said. My Mother, The Person and the Patient can be found in Amazon Music, Apple Podcast, or wherever you get your podcasts. Please remember to follow, like, and share, and join me next week as I share with you another episode of my mother's journey as both the person and the patient. Thank you.